Everybody, we'll call the Capital Improvement Advisory Committee meeting to order. Time is 6 o'clock. Next order of business, public hearing and workshop. Hold a public hearing, discussion, and possible action to approve recommendation to City Council regarding adoption of a roadway impact fee. Ms. Woodley.
Thank you. Oh, that's true. That's true. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to this special meeting instead of doubling up with a normal P&Z meeting. We appreciate that. We felt like this is an important topic that we want to get through and make sure that we leave enough time in case we can't come to a final recommendation tonight. We still have time within the statutory requirements to come up with something prior to council needing to take action. So, just a couple real quick backgrounds to keep us along the same lines that we've been going. The city's master thoroughfare plan was adopted in July. The land use assumptions and capital improvement plan were adopted in November of 2017, and that capital improvement plan is based on the thoroughfare plan, but includes projects identified as necessary to meet the needs of projected growth in the community. So the purpose of the roadway impact fee, and this is from Texas Government Code, is to provide a funding mechanism for identified capital improvements necessary to accommodate new development over a 10-year planning period. So this is our master thoroughfare plan that was adopted in July, and the capital improvement plan, which looks quite a bit like that, but only includes those roads that are either existing but not to their full capacity, or new roads that need to be constructed. So the total value of that capital improvement plan is $229 million. And the total cost attributable out of that $229 million attributable to new growth projected over the next 10 years is $57 million. So where do we come up with the money? We need $57 million to keep up with the development, so we can use property tax revenue, so the current citizens and businesses of the community would fund it. Of course, those dollars are competing with many, many other things that the community needs. Bond revenue, do want to point out that may require tax increases. Grants, matching funds, state and federal funds, which we are constantly going after whatever's available there. And another potential funding source would be the roadway impact fee assessed on new development. The benefits of this program would help to alleviate the burden of new facilities on the existing tax base. It facilitates the concept of growth paying for growth, provides a systematic and structured approach to assessment of fees. It enables developers to have upfront knowledge and predictability of what will be imposed on their development. And it fairly distributes the thoroughfare infrastructure costs to development based on service units rather than the location. So, as we presented last time, the maximum fees allowable that were calculated in each of the 4 service areas are as seen on this screen. So when the roadway impact fee is adopted, if council chooses to adopt it next month, these rates will be adopted as those maximum allowable rates. They're not what will necessarily be charged, but there will be an opportunity for council in subsequent years to, if they choose a lower rate, to raise the rates up to these maximums. Again, just a reminder of a sampling of the different land use equivalencies and the service units of development associated with each one of those land uses. So, here's what we need to talk about tonight, these policy considerations. And each one of these items you need to make a recommendation to council on. So we're going to talk about whether a fee is across the board, across citywide, or if you would recommend adopting different fees in the different 4 service areas. Whether or not there should be a different rate for residential versus non-residential, whether or not you would like to recommend establishing a cap of a maximum fee for any particular development, whether and how incremental increases might be incorporated into the program, and how will the fee imposition be phased in. So, the first policy consideration is same rate citywide versus a different fee in different service areas. What staff is recommending here is that you do adopt the same rate citywide. It gives a perception of parity across the city. In the focus groups that we did meet with and the different boards and commissions, we didn't get any sort of expressing of any desire to incentivize growth in any particular part of the city. As well, it provides much more ease of implementation for the developers and for city staff as they administer the program. So, now we really get into the big money question. Would you recommend different fee rates for residential versus non-residential? And what staff is recommending is that, yes, you do adopt different rates for residential and non-residential. The reason being, and I'll just read what I have here, the most significant new traffic generation complaints that are received is from new residential development. We don't hear a whole lot of complaints about particular businesses that are all of a sudden creating additional trips. There's really a perception, although it's not necessarily exactly accurate, but the perception is that new residential development is creating a lot of the traffic problems. Projections do indicate that residential development will be less affected than non-residential, and some of that gets to the cost of the median home values here that Mr. James has explained recently. I think he said about $290,000 is the median home price in the SEUC school district in the city. So we do feel like it basically gives an indication that home builders and the home prices can bear some additional fee without hurting that amount of development too much. There's also been very strong desire expressed in the development community, the business community, and with the Economic Development Corporation that we do want to continue to encourage economic growth via commercial and light industrial development. So in light of that, what staff is recommending is that we establish a residential base rate of $600 per service unit in the first year, which would equate to $2,022 per single family home, and that we establish a non-residential base rate of $100 per service unit, which equates to $56.90 for a 10,000 square foot office, $2,440 for a 20,000 square foot warehouse. So it's not extremely burdensome for those types of uses. Another consideration was, would you consider establishing a cap for a maximum fee? That's not really applicable in residential because residential is what it is. If there was a cap, we would just set that as the rate. But for non-residential, on the staff level, when we were looking at what we were going to recommend, we thought, well, we could set a rate that is somewhat higher, but then establish a cap that would, so these warehouses or shopping centers could get very, very big, but still only have a certain cap. And what we came up with, we thought was a better policy would be to have a fee that's low, but allow the large facility to pay based on that fee. And even without setting a cap, those numbers don't appear to be prohibitive. So, incremental increases. Staff is recommending that we do establish some incremental increases on the residential rate. Years 1 and 2 would be at $600 per service unit, and then years 3, 4, and 5, 8, 9, and 1,000. So the maximum in year 5, when it's time to look at the land use plan and capital improvement plan again and reevaluate, that maximum fee would be $3,370 per house. And for the non-residential, we were recommending no incremental increase over the first 5 years. Wait that 5-year period to see how it affects development. So then these are basically the same comparisons that you saw in tables in the last presentations, but what we've added in here is, instead of just showing our maximum, we've shown what staff is proposing or what we're recommending, which of course you can recommend something different, but for the residential, this would be the first 2 years here at 2002. So it is still higher than a number of cities, but it's very close to a few. And we did feel like there was an ability to do that without affecting development too much or burdening the home buyer significantly. And that would ramp up to the $3,370 in year 5. But still, this is significantly lower than the average maximum. Looking at the non-residential, you'll notice that everything that's been recommended is significantly lower than the maximum, significantly lower, but it still does allow us to collect some fees, and I'll show you how the fees add up in a little bit. So this would put us at the lower end of the spectrum on what other cities are charging. So there's your 20,000 square foot office, a 10,000 square foot shopping center, and a 100,000 square foot warehouse. So the last policy consideration that we'd like you to make a recommendation on is the phase-in of the fee imposition. There are many developments out there that their deal's already been made. They've gone to the extent of constructing public infrastructure, particularly for residential subdivisions. They've got approved and recorded plats, and there's just some infill homes that need to be built. And we are recommending that we allow 18 months from the date of adoption of the ordinance before they would have to start paying the fees for new building permits. The local government code does allow a municipality to collect fees after 1 year for projects in that situation, but we're recommending a slightly longer, more generous grace period. For lots on which a preliminary plat was approved prior to the adoption of the ordinance, we would suggest that we not charge impact fees on those within 1 year after the adoption. The local government code does provide no delay for that, so we're being more generous, but in all reality, if only a preliminary plat has been approved, it may be close to a year before those folks are ready to pull a building permit anyway, because a lot of them still need to do their public improvements in order to get their plat recorded. So then any other development would be charged at an impact fee basically immediately after the adoption of the ordinance. Of course, that would mean they still have to go through the full platting procedure, so likely that would be a year out as well. So I do definitely want to point out that even if this were adopted in March or April by council, there would still be quite a long time before we're actually going to start charging and collecting fees. It will take a number of years to build up until it's just like water and wastewater, where everyone pays those fees today. And we actually have a good chunk of money to work with. So looking at it from the other side, to show you what we might generate in funding based on the rates that staff is recommending, and then if you decide to do a slightly different rate, at least you have an idea of what the ballpark is for what we might collect. So what we did was we looked at, and I think I might have had a slide like this in the previous presentation, but I just said look at 350 homes built in 1 year and $1 million of non-residential development. We took that and we fine-tuned it a little more, and we broke it down by service area, and we said, okay, we had about 350 single-family residence permits pulled over the last year, and they were broken down by service area approximately as shown here. General office broken down by service area here, medical office, shopping center, warehouse, and so on. So if we had another year like this, once everything is implemented, once everyone's paying after the grace periods and all of that, so it's not like this will happen in year 2019, but it should start happening over the next few years. This is how much we would generate in each one of the zones in 1 year. So to give you an idea of what that means, what might we do with those fees that we've collected? So we have a perfect example of a project that's going on now that you all are apologize, not you, but you will hear more about it, I'm sure. The Parklands project, which is up off Eckerd Road. So Eckerd Road has half the width of improvement adjacent to the Cypress Point subdivision. They did the improvements of their half of the road. An agreement was come to with the Parklands developer for them to shift their responsibility of their half of the road on their side adjacent to the subdivision and move it down toward the intersection with 35 to provide a better entrance for their subdivision, Cypress Point subdivision. Everyone, they thought we'd get more bang for our buck as a community by having them construct down there. What we lose on that is the fact that now it is fully the city's responsibility or the city's burden to build that half section adjacent to the Parklands. So it's a gap, and we need funding for it, and it's on the thoroughfare plan, it's on the capital improvement plan. These funds could be used to construct that gap. This was just, here's Eckerd Road, here's 35, here's Cypress. Parklands is up here. So this is Parklands. This light yellow strip here is what the city will have to build because Parklands will have already met their obligation. Cypress Point built their half of Eckerd Road, so the city will need to build this at some point. This blue portion and the pink portion, the Parklands developer is hoping to build it, but if his funding runs out or if he changes his mind, whoever develops this property will be responsible to build that. If they do, they'll get credits toward their impact fees. But the cost estimate for the construction of this portion here, $271,000. And lo and behold, that's somewhat close to the amount that we could potentially generate based on the rates that we're recommending or somewhere in that ballpark in Service Area 1. So it isn't a whole lot of money, but it could fill in gaps like this. So to let you know where we are on the schedule, we've met with all of the boards and commissions. City Council last night did pass a resolution setting a date for a public hearing for the roadway impact fee program, and that public hearing will be on March 13th. We've had focus group meetings with the development community. We met with home builders, developers, industrial developers, engineers, and some of the current local businesses to get feedback that we did roll into our recommendation to you. So tonight we'll discuss what I presented. You can all discuss among yourselves and then craft a recommendation. If we can't come to a recommendation this evening, there is still time. There has to be a written recommendation from the CIAC to the City Council at least 5 business days prior to this March 13th date. So there's still time to meet again if necessary in order to make that recommendation. And with that, I will let you.
All right, next order of business is that this is a public hearing, so we'll officially open the public hearing at 6:20. Seeing as how we have a long line of people waiting to speak, we'll close the public hearing at 6:21, and we'll open up discussion with the commission. Commissioners, comments, questions?
I have a question on the non-residential, no increments for over 5 years. what does that bring to our table? I mean, if we did 3 years, what would be the impact?
So in other words, if you increased from $100 to a different value,
No, if we increased, it says no incremental increase over first 5 years. If we said over the first 3 years, what would be the difference? I mean,
well, the difference would be then that you would suggest an increase for years 4 and 5.
Okay.
So you could potentially, let's see. Let's see. So for 1 year, for the residential generation, let's take zone 1 as an example. I'm sorry, non-residential. We'll take zone 1. So that $69,000, if you increased your rate to $200 in the 4th year, you would double that amount for that year.
Okay.
I guess just real quick, could you give us a little bit more on the feedback from the development community at the stakeholder meeting that you had with them and some comments that they made?
I think most of their comments were a lot of questions about what happens if we're already platted. We got that question from a number of folks. Do you want to chime in on this?
There was nobody in the developer group going, yeah, this is great. We've been waiting for another fee or another charge. Didn't hear that from anybody. I think some of the folks, as we walk them through it and we walk them through the why of this, and the why of this is we are struggling, we feel like we are struggling to keep up with our road construction demand based on new development. They all got that. They experienced that. And we said, you know, it's the challenges you guys have going, hey, I've got this project. When are you going to improve this road that people have to drive down to get to my deal? Or, you know, my trucks have trouble getting out on this road because it's always backed up. So I think they got the concept. Certainly they got the idea that somebody has to pay. I think some of the folks viewed it as more of, yeah, city charges fees for this stuff. You know, you guys go up on fees periodically, either up the amount of building permit fees or you add a new fee, and that's just sort of the cost of it. You know, and that's kind of what we heard. We didn't hear a lot of very specific answers that was sort of actionable, but I clearly got the impression from the residential folks that if you went up to the maximum amount right of way, we feel like that would have a pretty significant impact on residential development, that would be tough for them to accommodate. The commercial stuff was a bit odd, and I'll relate this. We had a couple of folks here from a large Fortune 100 company, probably 500 company, big company. And as we walked through some of the maximum numbers on commercial, you know, like 100,000 square foot warehouse or you know, it was like $200,000. So like, yeah, okay, that's nothing. To them, we spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on these facilities. That's a drop in the bucket. But clearly, again, I would go back and maybe, again, what we didn't hear as much from, but what I would assume the perception, you recall we heard from Dr. Bammel, with regard to the tree ordinance, or some of you did. I'm sorry, Mr. Brown and Dr. Pinshore didn't, but we had a vet who's trying to open an office, and the tree pres ordinance on the site she picked was going to cost her about $40,000, and she said, yeah, that's a significant cost to my project. So again, a roadway impact fee, again, knowing her comments on the tree pres ordinance, a roadway impact fee of $20,000 tacked on, that's a big hit as well. So I think that's a bit of what we got. Maybe I'd characterize it. The folks that do this, a lot of places, large corporations, yeah, there are a lot of costs, drop in the bucket, whatever. Smaller folks, a tougher thing to sort of swallow. And then with residential, it was very much, yeah, fees go up, we get it, you know, we'll deal with it. If you go up too much, it's going to be a problem. And so I think that then, frankly, and again, it was hard to quantify, but that went into sort of our recommendation, which is, a fairly low fee for non-res that, in light of the development costs, don't seem to kind of break the bank, or not really likely the thing that would be the big issue for them. And then for residential, a stair step that they could work into going forward. But I think the takeaway from the city that to be cognizant is, really, if we're going to do this with roadway impact fees, particularly for residential, we need to be careful not to raise other fees, because again, I think they'd have a very different reaction if we came back and we doubled the fee per valuation on a res project. That would have an impact. So again, will you hear some people grumble about it? I think so. We hear other people go, yeah, it's everywhere, it's going on. I think you'll hear that. But I think they got it. Nobody was saying this is the craziest thing I ever heard of.
Question.
Yes, sir.
In the other cities that are listed here that have impact fees, any idea how long those have been in existence, and if there's any track record of the effect that these impact fees have had on development of one sort or another, or is that just kind of a big unknown?
It's really a big unknown, and so again, I'm not sure on these how long they've had it. I will tell you, we didn't do as much surveying, but in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area, they have had impact fees for a very long time. So again, I worked for the city of McKinney. When I started there, city of McKinney had a roadway impact fee. That was 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, they had a roadway impact fee. The hard part is even McKinney and the cities around us, and we tracked how they adjusted their fees to gauge, was you couldn't really tell the impact because of larger trends with the economy. And so when the economy would sort of go up or go down, that would have more of a factor on it. So the story I sort of tell is, in the boom days, call it 15 years ago, developers' concerns were, how quick can you get me through the process, because I can sell this house as soon as I get it on the ground? And the answer was, well, you got to pay this. It was like, I'll pay whatever. Don't care, don't matter. I mean, literally, developers, not that they didn't grumble, but literally, I'll pay whatever I need to pay. They could make so much money because it was booming. When the economy took a turn, that changed, and everyone was much more cost conscious, and it would have had a greater impact. So I think what I'd say is, there isn't really a way to know because of the other factors that affect that going into it. What I'd say, and Lisa may agree with this or not, what we often see with our trends on residential as they go up or down, it has to do with a subdivision that's doing a lot of lots, building out. So as Kensington was up and running, down here off 1518 and kind of down from Schertz Parkway, they were doing a lot of houses. When that project sort of built out, if there wasn't another project in the vicinity or nearby to sort of pick up that, we would see a dip. And I think we saw that a few years ago. We saw the number of lots available dip, but then we've had projects come in, and so we saw the number of new home construction go up. So I think it's really hard to gauge with it what the impact of that fee is, going forward.
Another question, if I may. In regard to the commercial properties, is there anything that the city of Schertz is doing to soften the economic blow to potential businesses that are coming in to put a warehouse or a manufacturing plant? Are we like reducing taxes or giving other incentives in addition to having a much lower impact fee? I mean, what's the strategy, I guess, is my question.
So, and I would look to Mr. Brown to chime in if he would in his role on the Economic Development Corporation. But as you probably know, the city has an Economic Development Corporation, so a portion of our sales tax goes to that. And certainly how we have incented projects over the years, we've kind of changed our mindset in the way we do it. But it really is based on the investment that comes forward and the jobs created. We have the ability to provide incentives and do that in a number of factors. It may be, we haven't done this as often, but we have done it occasionally, I think, with the GE facility with some infrastructure construction a bit. So we can do infrastructure construction. We can effectively do 380 agreements where and this is technically rebate a portion of the sales taxes when they hit certain benchmarks. So for the big projects, another Amazon, a 300,000 square foot warehouse, and we kind of joked about this, but we literally at the business owner meeting said this, likely for this fee for those type of developments, those folks walk in and go, what are all my costs? And then they turn around and go to EDC staff and they say, if you want the project, here are my costs, here's what you have to, here's what I would need, or here's what I'm asking for to try to locate here. So for those big projects, that would likely, in my opinion, roll into their ask with regard to incentives. But for, again, retail, we don't really do, particularly small professional offices, we don't do that, and there isn't really a way to soften it that we do at all with it. No, sir.
My question is on total fees to build, for example, single-family residence. I'm just looking. I see the water and sewer impact fee is about $7,700. We're going to add about $2,000 here. Permitting, et cetera. What is that total?
You know, your total right now, typical single-family. I think Lisa offered up. Go ahead again.
It's probably about between $10,000 and $11,000 total
before the impact fee.
Before the roadway impact.
Yeah.
So another question for you. These impact fees, do they get multiplied in the final house cost, or are they passed straight through to the buyer, typically?
So it happens really a couple of ways, and I would say how it gets paid for effectively depends on how aware all of the different folks in the process are. So again, for home builders who are keenly aware that we have this, they pass this on to the home buyer. It goes into the price of the house. So when you're meeting, you're going, I really like this model and I want to do this with the garage. What's that house going to cost me? They have rolled those fees into the price of the home. So ultimately, generally, it is the home buyer that pays for that because it's collected at the time of building permit. And so that's where it's factored in. Yes, sir. So generally, it is the end user who pays for it, so the home buyer in a residential situation.
And would you say that typically that these impact fees are passed straight through? I read an article, I forget when it was published, I think it was published in 2008, that was saying that there was like 2.5 times in whatever cities they were talking about, I don't know if it was in Texas or not, that an impact fee was going to be multiplied 2.5 times by the time it got to the homeowner's amount. So someone was making a multiple of that, and I don't know if that applies or doesn't apply or is a reality or not.
I've not seen that. Again, where it gets more complicated is when a credit's involved. So when a developer is building a section of road, there's a credit. He then factors, he's typically, the developer, when he's looking to buy a piece of land, estimates his costs to put in the infrastructure, to do the project, et cetera, how much he thinks he can sell the lots for, what the home builder can. He goes to the property owner and says, this is what I think your land is worth. If there's less infrastructure to be built and the property owner is savvy, they're going to know that and say, no, my land is worth more. Sewer is right here, water is here. And so that complicates it. But what I would say is, no, in a competitive environment where, again, up here, folks have the choice, and I'll be real blunt, a lot of folks come up here in this area looking for a house. They're not necessarily set on, man, the quality of the planning and zoning commissioners in Schertz, I really want to live there versus stay away from Cibolo. They don't, I think most people come up to an area, they're frankly more concerned with the school district they're in than they are the city limit boundaries. I think a lot of folks, from what I've talked to people, I thought I was moving into Schertz because the mailing address, but I'm in Cibolo. And so in that competitive environment, it's all about how much profit the home builder can make and whether they justify that profit as doubling up on fees or they're passing it on directly. It's hard to say, but I think if it's competitive and they're competing with others, they then, as anything, their margins are a bit lower and they don't double up on that fee. But I would argue that most home buyers have no idea what the various fees go to the city on. The developer, home builder probably tells them, well, you've got city fees and that factors in and that's da-da-da-da-da, but doesn't go through a breakdown and go, yeah, you're paying $2,000 in roadway impact fee. And so again, because of that, it's all rolled into the sale price of the house.
As it should be.
Yeah, as it should be. Exactly. I would agree with you. Yeah.
So total fees, $13,000 to $14,000. So we're talking 5% of the total price of our starter homes in Schertz. That's really where we're getting at.
So what I'll give you, yeah, is a typical, and I'll use the school district because that's probably the most accurate. So and Richard, correct me, but I think the median price of a new home in Schertz in SCUCISD is about $290,000. And so again, I have to rely on people who are better at math. If we were doing 3,000, it'd be real easy. It's almost 1%. But, you know, you can look, that's really the cost that we're talking of going up. And then with regard to the fee amount as well, yeah, the fees they pay are about, 3%, something like that, of the new home construction.
$13,000 worth of fees on a $290,000 house is 4.4%.
Thank you, Commissioner Dolly.
So how much would that be over the life of a mortgage?
Wow. Again, I'm going to look to somebody else to.
Most people don't care as long as they can afford the mortgage.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say this again. I think what Kathy probably explained, and I apologize for being late. I was at a school district meeting. When we selected the recommendation, what we picked, and we're certainly not perfect and could be wrong, was a fee amount on residential that we think will have a nominal impact on the number of single-family homes we issue every year. We don't think it'll really have an impact on the number of homes. I think a greater concern is all of those things go into the price of a home. And again, I've said this before, $290,000 median price for a new home in Schertz and SCUCISD is a lot of money. And again, I sort of speak as a city staff person for a lot of city staff. There are very few city staff people who are going out buying a $290,000 home, including myself. I certainly couldn't. And so I think we are empathetic to that. And I think that is of a concern. And I think that is a larger issue that the nation is having with regard to the cost of construction and the cost of development and pricing people out. It's not solely this, but every one of those fees adds up. And so I think that's the greater concern we've got, is that this will affect us over time in terms of the affordability of our community, rather than we're going to see a significant drop. Because frankly, even if we saw our residential permits go from 375 to 350, to us, I think most people would say, I can't tell you if that's good or bad. Maybe it's better to be a little bit slower. I don't know. But certainly if we went from 375 down to 275, that's a big impact in something. So thus we said, let's stair step it. Let's say it's going to go up so everybody knows, but let's watch it. And those are some qualitative conversations that we'll have. What are you hearing? What are we hearing? What do the numbers appear to doing? What are our numbers doing relative to other places? And we may then have the ability to say, let's not do this increase at a time because we're concerned. And so that's part of what went into our recommendation, because there's so many unknowns.
So what are the negatives to slower growth?
The negatives to slower growth are it pushes up, it does two things. One is there are a lot of folks who rely on growth for their living. They're in the construction industry, they live here, they work as contractors, they do this, and so it has a negative implication to them. The other thing I would say to slower growth, and this is qualified with slower growth created due to city regulation, and by regulation, regulations, fees, growth management, whatever, is it drives up the price of things. There are fewer things going on, and the cost generally goes way up with that. And so again, it's an affordability issue, and it's affordability not just for somebody to live here, but again, as an example, and as a doctor or dentist or whatever, part of where you may locate a new practice is not just the folks that are there today, but the folks that you anticipate moving to the community going forward. And so again, as you slow those things down, that can have an impact. Again, it can have an impact on things like restaurants, particularly national chains that really look at demographics and say, this community seems to be pressing down growth, that could continue. We may not see the population increases to support a resident. So that's where it can have, you have trouble getting some of those services that people want.
So to tie into that, eventually there's a build out where there's no more construction within a city limits, assuming that you're surrounded by other cities that don't let you expand into them. So then the model then you have whatever you have, what you built out to that, and it has to be sustainable. So my interest, having been here forever, is that, and I'm planning to be here for another forever.
Yes, sir.
Is I want whatever we build out to be sustainable,
Yeah.
to be quality enough, to be well built enough and well planned enough to where 30 years from now, it's not crumbling like the Glen or some of the other areas in San Antonio that built out like a Roman candle and then turned into nothing. And that's, somewhere there, I don't know where the balance is. I'm a dentist and a rancher. I don't know the ins and outs of real estate development. But what I think personally is what I want for my area, which is the southern part of Schertz, is for that area to develop out in a manner that is sustainable, well thought out, drains well, doesn't flood me out, and not only has value financially in the future, but is a place where people would want to live and work.
Yeah. And so I'll say this. I think that's what the city is after as well in terms of what we understand, which is a sustainable community. So what we don't want to do is make decisions that are short-sighted today, but yet 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 100 years. Because frankly, I think once we are all gone, because we won't be here forever, there will 3 generations down the road, 200 years later, 150 years, there's somebody here sitting there going, what were they doing back in 2018 that made this bad decision? And so I think part of what goes into that is if we look at the different costs and benefits, taxes, if you will, and cost of service for different land uses. And so what that means at times is telling someone who comes in going, I want to do this kind of a project here, we say, no, it's not consistent with the zoning, it's not consistent with our comprehensive plan, and it's part of a longer range decision. So again, to be blunt, the hardest thing, and I think P&Z has experienced this, is telling somebody no. And telling somebody no because where you've picked is just a bad fit. So that's one thing. I think the other thing I'd say, you are correct, are putting in place standards to ensure quality and sustainability down the road. And I think that is a bigger challenge in a very, very high growth environment, because what you'll often see again is you'll see large swaths of a city that were built out over the course of 2 decades, and they all age at the same rate. And so think about how either fashion trends or areas of a community age, and you see this a lot. They're the new area, very nice, new kinds of amenity, very desirable. Often those schools out there, their football and basketball team tend to be the best in the area. Growth moves on. They still sort of sustain, but then 20, 30 years later, it's not what it was. They're newer areas, newer amenities. Why would I pay this for an old home? I get a new home, everything I want. Styles of homes change. Who wants a ranch house? Now it's like, how many pitches can we fit on a roof is the trend. But ranch, blasé, and you don't like it and whatever. And then eventually, take areas of San Antonio, they come back, they come in favor. But the areas that tend to come back and come in favor, and I'll use San Antonio as an example, and not to be overclittery, it's not the Ray Ellison neighborhoods. It's the older neighborhoods that when they were built were the high quality, more desirable neighborhoods. So Dignity, Tobin, those are the areas with good bones in the housing stock, good amenities. They've fallen, but then they've come back up. But the sort of large cookie cutter, monotonous development, you rarely, if ever, see those come back. And so I think, again, we had a lot of conversations a number of years ago about lot size, and it really was, lot size was a big deal, and we talked a lot about, is it really about lot size, or is it about what that development looks like? So curvilinear streets, view corridors coming in, centrally located usable open space as opposed to the leftover drainage easement covered thing that gets handed off to the city. And those are the things that we have tried to do to improve sustainability of the areas. And again, I think we tend to watch that now. Which neighborhoods do we kind of like? Which do we not like? What works, what doesn't? So I agree with you. And so the fastest growth you can have is not necessarily a good thing, I would say, is maybe my reaction to that. I agree. It's not all about having growth go as fast as we can. It's about having a growth that we feel like we can keep up with going forward. And so the reality is, again, if we struggle to keep up with infrastructure, likely citizens will turn and say, you're not keeping up with roads. The problem is you need to slow growth down, and you do that through other artificial means. We increase other costs, we up development standards, we backdoor it to slow growth. We don't put in sewer lines or sewer plants to effectively prevent development. And this be what you have happened.
I have a question, and you'll have to pardon me because this is the first time I've seen all this material. Kind of touching on the competitive nature and edge and looking at what our neighbors are doing, I noticed some pretty big variances in the impact between what Schertz is proposing and what Cibolo has going on right now. Was there much consideration given to what's going on right in our own backyard when it comes to these impact fees and what we might attract or lose as far as development in those fees go?
So there was, I say this, there was some, we were cognizant of what other cities charged. We didn't just ignore it and blindly go forward. But it wasn't necessarily, particularly for residential, a driving factor. So, and I appreciate you're brand new and great welcome to P&Z and CIAC. So for instance, in Schertz, we require on pretty much all our new single-family homes, or all single-family homes coming in with the zoning, a 10-foot side yard separation, or 10-foot side yard setback. So there's 20 feet of separation between residential homes. So on this lot, you have a home, you've got 10 feet on either side. Lot next door has 10 feet on either side. Pretty much every place else, it's a 5-foot side yard setback, 10-foot separation. Would you agree that that is the thing that drives, other than lot size, drives residential developers the craziest? Because that is a huge cost. Because again, for residential folks, they would rather go narrower lots that are deeper because it's more cost effective given the cost of infrastructure of the street. So we have artificially said, because building code doesn't require that, we've just said as a community we want more separation. And so you can imagine on a stretch how many houses they effectively lose and the usability of that. Because frankly, how much do people use their side yard? They don't. So you're not even creating area that the home buyer finds usable. It's an aesthetic, looks a little less crowded, cramped. So part of what I'd say is to just look at the impact fee. In my mind, again, if you asked a developer, would you rather pay a $2,000 single-family residential impact fee, or I'd go not even down to 5 and 10, but 7 and 14? I think they'd go, I'll pay that $2,000 impact fee, give me the 7 and 14. And so to some degree, I think we have other factors that more significantly impact our competitiveness. Now, as an example, Garden Ridge, they are much more restrictive with regard to the kind of residential they allow. So it's not a fee thing. It's about lot size, where we let you plat, how we develop. And so from our perspective on residential, we don't think the $2,000 is going to have an effect. There are other things that are a greater factor. We are more cognizant of it with regard to commercial because, again, while large projects can go to EDC and say, hey, here's a cost, and EDC now is just paying out more to incent projects that's coming off sales tax, that can be dealt with. what we hear a large complaint for folks is, I want a place to eat, I want a small place to shop, I want a doctor or somebody here, and that's where we think that fee has the biggest effect, and that is probably what most led to us dropping that fee down. And again, I say this, my father was a dentist, and so with all due respect, but you have people who are in particular professions who are good at what they do. They're doctors, they're dentists, they're whatever. That's what they do, they're good at it. They are generally not real estate developer people, and so again, they don't often know if I go to Schertz versus Cibolo, I'm going to pay this or that. It's once they get in, and then they get frustrated. But I think most of those folks don't have a clue. Again, my father is an example. He moved his practice, and he said the foundation of his new building cost as much as him to open his entire practice 20 years before. He said that was insane. The dentist I go to was telling me his new building and said, yeah, you would not believe what this thing costs. So I think there's that. But really, I think what it does is those folks who are maybe more aware of the development cost, it affects them a little more than those folks who frankly get in and don't know, and then once they're in, they're stuck. I've closed. All right, well, I guess I got to pay the fee.
Well, one of the bigger variances was on the commercial shopping center, where Cibolo is currently at $67,952 and Schertz is coming in at $4,230.
Mm-hmm.
So and again, first time I've seen all this, first time I've spoken about it.
You're fine.
Is there a missed opportunity there when we're talking about commercial shopping centers?
Yeah, I think there is a missed I think, well, let me say this from my perspective. The commercial fee proposed, we think there is a missed opportunity there. But what I will say is we are approaching this with commercial in a very cautious manner, and it's less about, and I say this, it's less about how much I leave on the table over, call it a 2-year window, because if what we find is that these fee rates, yeah, everybody's like, oh, that's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing. We can come back and we can up it. So we would rather leave some money on the table in a window of time, because we can always go up. And again, we can always go up to the maximum accessible. Literally, after 2 years, y'all can come back and go, hey, this is nuts. They're not batting an eye. Jack it all the way up. We have the ability to do that. We would rather do that than think we're not going to have an impact and really negatively impact it going forward. And so that's the approach we took. So yeah, we think we've come in low. There's a bit of a missed opportunity. Not to say we're right, but that was the logic of it. The logic of it is the perception we had is that folks that we heard on the different boards and commissions and the input communities would rather be very cautious. You can always go up as opposed to coming in and missing the mark and really having some impact that's maybe longer term and harder to recover. But that's not to say that we couldn't bump it and
has it been determined at what point that this will be revisited, reassessed, reevaluated to look at this? I mean, a year after this is implemented, or?
So no, that's a very good question. So I'll repeat some conversations I've had with Commissioner Bro. We have not done a good job with the CIAC, the capital improvements, the semi-annual, twice-a-year reports, with really giving a full picture. It's really just been, here's how much money we've taken in, we've spent a little of it, approve it, send it on. And part of that has to do with our current ordinances with regard to water and sewer and some things like that. But what we plan to start doing with roadway, and it'll take a while for us to kick in, is really have some of those more in-depth conversations of what's the highest priority projects, or what are we looking to fund the soonest, how are we coming along on that, and then to really start looking at some of those development numbers to say, how do we think this has affected us? So here's what we were doing, here's what Cibolo was doing, here's what San Antonio was doing. Here's how we've all changed over the course of a year. What do we think the implication was? What are we hearing from EDC? Again, so bring in some of the folks from our EDC staff to say, here's a qualitative assessment. We are hearing this from people on commercial projects as to why we're locating or not locating in Schertz, and to do a bit more of that. So the idea is every 6 months we would be talking about it, and literally the easy thing is once you impose this and you do the hard work, for the next 5 years, at any point you want to up or lower the fee, you can do that fairly easily. It's just a notice, so we have the ability to do that. So our goal is to try to do a better job of that with roadway than we've done in the past.
But then, sorry, just to point out that statutorily, we have to reevaluate the land use assumptions in the capital improvement plan every 5 years. So, like Brian said, we'll look at this every 6 months to keep tabs on it, and these numbers can change. Still can't go over the maximum, but we're absolutely required every 5 years to do a full relook.
But I think the policy look, we really need to follow more closely, and I think that the way the ordinances helps us with that. Again, as I've said before, there isn't a right or wrong answer. There's truly not. It's to some degree about how quickly do you want to build roads, and who do you want to have pay for it? And there's not an answer that I think doesn't have some negative implications with it. It's a balancing act. That's what it comes down to. Because again, as my dad said, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and money doesn't grow on trees. Somebody's paying.
Another question, perhaps. Assuming City Council approves whatever we recommend at the meeting, when would the first impact fees be collected?
So they're collected at time of building permit. So it would likely collect sooner on commercial, because what we've done is as Kathy mentioned, is if you already have a preliminary plat approved or you're already platted, we're going to grace you for a year, year and a half. Residential construction, single family, tends to take longer. So if somebody came in the day after this was passed and it went into effect on council and they submitted a plat application, they'd effectively probably be the first. But you've got a construction window of a subdivision and review process of a year and a half. So you're almost 2 years out maybe before you start having residential homes pay. Commercial goes more quickly, and so we could literally have commercial project walk in going, here's the plat, here's the site plan. Plat gets filed 3 months later because there aren't public improvements to go in, and they pull a building permit a couple months after that. So literally on commercial, within 6 months, you could start seeing people pay the fee. But likely, to be honest, for the first 2 years, not a whole lot of folks are going to be paying the fee. It's probably a 2-year window when you're really going to see it kick up because of those phase-in windows.
And so the phase-in that you have here of year 1 and 2, then year 3, 4, and 5 incrementally increasing, that is mostly to see, kind of like testing the water and seeing how the response is to this?
It's mostly sort of testing the water, yeah, to kind of gauge it. Because again, what we have is developers and then national builders, they're fairly savvy on this. And so even if they're not yet paying the fee and they see that, we'll get feedback from them on what that does or how it affects the projects, because they'll factor that in. And so we'll start hearing from them before they even start paying.
Brian.
Yes, sir.
And Kathy. I see a big disparity between residential and non-residential. I think we're being too generous on the non-residential. Mm-hmm. Is there a way, and let's use our vet as an example. That's a small business.
Yes, sir.
Private small business.
Private small business.
And I would say, I'm not a business person, not a real estate person, but I would think that it's a little bit more difficult for a private small business to get off the ground than a major corporation. Cisco, Caterpillar, so on and so forth.
Yep.
Is there a way, and I guess what I might suggest is that we come up with two categories. One for a small business type operation that we don't scare off. And then another category for the large corporations, like as you said, what's the fees? Okay, we'll negotiate all that, let's go, let's build. Can we come up with two? Because I'm just looking at the $100 per service unit for a non-residential, that covers a lot of bases, and I think we're missing out.
So you can do this. So there's not a perfect way to do that relative to a small business versus a large. So what the power we have is we can do it by service area, which I don't think gets at that at all in this case. We can do it based on the list of type of use. So we've got a list of 25, 30 different types of uses that we can go through. And so to some degree, you can try to pluck out of those what might be a small business versus what wouldn't be a small business. I think that's problematic, though. So take the category of restaurant. Can't tell if it's an Abel's versus a Chili's. There's not a way to distinguish that. Even, again, medical office, you can't tell if it's a LabCorp or if it's a private kind of practice thing. There's not a real good way to do that. The other thing you can do is you can sort of go in and create kind of caps based on the size of the building as to what it might be, but there is not a real good way to do that, to say this person I'm okay with paying more, but this person I'm not. There's not really a way to do that, no, sir.
Because I'm having a little, what I don't like is we're going to the highest roadway impact fee on residential in all of our study areas, the absolute highest by far. But then on the non-residential, it's a smidgen. It's hardly anything.
So if I may, on residential, and let me say this, on residential, we are not going to the highest on there at all. We're in the phase and we get to about halfway.
No, but the actual charge.
The actual charge.
The gold section.
So yeah, so if you look at res, the actual charge of $3,370 isn't $5,400.
Yeah, but from what the chart shows that everybody else is collecting, $28.79 in Waxahachie, $15.13 in Lockhart, $15.15 in Cibolo, and so forth. Mm-hmm. We're by far the highest.
On roadway impact fees, yes, sir.
Roadway impact fees.
Mm-hmm.
We're by far the highest. Then
Yes.
you go to non-residential, and we're barely off the line.
That's correct. And so a couple things that I would offer up with regard to this. One is we don't know what sort of happens on the back end. So we don't know what happens with incentives like the Economic Development Corporation and to what degree they step in and they incent those things. There also is some issue of those communities down there are very different relative to where they are and what they're trying to do and how much development they have. So again, I think what you're seeing in Lockhart and Taylor is probably a very different situation than what you're seeing in, New Braunfels, for example. So again, every community is different, and there's not a right or wrong answer. I certainly appreciate the fact that you're saying, hey, comparing to other cities, maybe the comment, we could go up on the non-res. We certainly could. What I would say here is that my perception in the community is that the community highly values non-residential development. It is something that we consider to be very desirable. We have blocked out a significant amount of land for non-residential development. We have denied apartment complexes recently, or recommended denial of rezones for apartment because we want to preserve commercial. We highly prize non-residential development. We hear from our residents, and you may disagree, and certainly I appreciate that we want places to shop, places to go to the doctor, things like that. We feel like those commercial uses really bring in tax base. And so thus, we're willing to forego some on the front end, which is what a roadway impact fee is, for that long-haul tax payment. Now, a couple other things I'll tell you with regard to res that we discussed a bit with council last year. We have a pretty high number, relatively speaking, of homes that have a military disability exemption to some degree. So we, in fact, did a comparison just looking at a graphic of, I think it was Colleyville up in the Dallas area, and it's readily apparent. And so what we think, not fully, but that we have a relatively high number of those exemptions. Nothing wrong with it. I don't think anybody is saying that there is. These are folks who've served our country. They've been hurt or injured. They deserve that. That's. But we're not necessarily bringing in the tax base that folks would expect. And so then the idea is this is an opportunity to get a little more on the front end of res to help offset that. But it really comes down to commercial. How much do you value commercial? How much are you willing to maybe damp down or tamp down that commercial growth? And if the concern is, it seems to, I don't think it'll have an effect. If it does have some effect, it's a fair share thing, then you'd want to bump it up. Is not a right or wrong answer. That was our logic. But again, we were really, from ours, this was a starting point. But truly do, if you think differently, we embrace that to move up or down on them.
If I might point out here, our year 1 and 2 is only $700 more than New Braunfels.
Yeah.
Yeah, granted, we're going up from 0 to 2,000, but it's still only $700 more than what New Braunfels has already been charging. And they can go up whenever their next increases are as well. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the residential side, a little bit, again, you know, that's why I added it all up. Less than 5% of the total price of a home by a long shot is not all that much. And I agree wholeheartedly with Mr. James that the impact of bringing commercial in that's providing actual tax dollars to offset the lack of tax dollars that we get from residential, jobs, et cetera, it far outweighs the lower impact fees that we may be charging them. I think in the long run, we're better off growing the commercial side for its own value versus trying to eke out a few $1,000s more out of them. And at the same time, the actual number difference is not all that significant on a residential side. And what you're talking about, the military exemptions, it's huge. Yeah. We know that, you know, from a realtor perspective. Trust me, we have a ton of people that are buying here because they can, because they're not paying taxes, and so it's good for them. Yeah, and nothing wrong with that. You know, I'm a vet and everything else, but we also see that people are coming in to. And it's not to take advantage by any means, but they're taking advantage of the benefit that is afforded them by, you know, state and local tax laws, and that's great. But at the same time, we all know that residential taxes don't cover the cost of residential services either.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say to keep in mind too that you may want to keep in mind is our building permit fees, our general building permit fees, those go into the general fund and we can spend them on whatever we want. We can spend them on roads, we can spend them on parks, we can spend them on city staff, we can spend them on firefighters, whatever we want to do. Roadway impact fees just have to be spent on roads. Utility impact fees just have to be spent on utilities. Again, we have chosen to charge, I believe, the max we can charge for utility. And again, I've not gotten the impression from anybody, let's go up on roadway and pull down on water and sewer. And you may remember, and I don't think Kathy has it, and I don't have it with me, but you may recall last time we talked and we showed that breakdown of fees. On the commercial stuff, a big chunk was water and sewer impact fees. I mean, it was a significant amount. And so again, you would have the ability to go, let's cut that down by 25% and let's make up that difference in roadway. That's a thing, but I think what we would say is, like, I'm not keeping up as is, so we aren't recommending that. But just to keep everything relatively speaking, we have charged that. So, yeah.
I guess I don't think we're anywhere near max on the utility fees.
We're not at the max, but we can't afford to go cutting back on them. The utility fees are just about what they should be. If anything, they should be a little higher. No matter what we do, we're going to be behind the power curve. We learned that 20 years ago.
And I can certainly verify that, and we can communicate. And I may be very wrong, and I appreciate that, Commissioner Breaux. My recollection, perception is that we are charging pretty much what we can from the city's perspective on water and sewer impact fees.
I guess I'd like to add in on what Commissioner Breaux was saying about trying to find a way to do something for the truly small business. And, as I've looked at this and listened to the discussion and the other reading that I've done, I feel that possibly the only way that we could do something that would really target the small business owners is to maybe focus on something that's based on square footage. The vet clinic, the dentist office, or whatever, in my mind, a small business is going to be typically 5,000 or 6,000 square feet max. And that if you have a business that comes in with a plan that is less than that, more than likely is going to be a truly small business and locally owned. Of course, you're going to have your Starbucks, which is 400 square feet, and it's a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
So if I may just, and I apologize.
No, go.
Keep in mind the caveat. The problem with that is you're right. We're thinking of the doctor's office, the dentist's office that goes in a freestanding building, as opposed to what we strive for is, hey, it'd be nice to get a 3-4 story larger, maybe 50, 60,000 square foot medical office building, and then they lease space to that doctor or dentist or dermatologist or whatever. So what I've now done is I've done a disincentive to get that larger project that still frankly leases out to small businesses, and it's a bit like the home thing. Who is paying? Ultimately, I may not get that bigger footprint building because the fee on that ratchets up because we were trying to help small businesses, but effectively 90% of the folks that are in there are small businesses. That's the challenge that you've got with it. And then the question is your construction cost per square foot higher on a freestanding than it is on that larger building? And it may be what you want to be, visibility, things like that. But typically, the larger building you get, the more efficiencies, the more economies of scale you get. And so now we're kind of, the impact fee increase, if it's enough on that bigger to make that, we've now pushed you into a higher construction cost where you're having to buy a piece of land as opposed to going and lease a space to be able to grow a business thing like that. So again, I apologize for interrupting, but maybe keep that.
No, it's good. It's good discussion.
Yeah.
And I guess while we're at it, we did have one person join us. We'd already opened and closed the public hearing, Mr. Jevitt, but if you have any questions or comments, I'll be happy to reopen the public hearing so you can participate. Okay. Commissioners, more questions?
I'll make one more comment. Because I've watched this area grow for the last 50 years, the cities and the school districts have been playing catch-up the entire time. It, to me, has been a huge frustration, particularly as drainage, because drainage affects me more than anything. But and that's tied very much into roadways as well. In the past, a developer would develop a subdivision and run their ditch to the road, and then it would go nowhere. So I think that impact fees are a good alternative to the taxation and bond issues that we have. Not that it rules that out and doesn't replace it, but it gives money up front to do something with more rapidly. There's not the lag time that there is with the bond process, which is a significant lag time, and taxes nobody likes and goes kicking and screaming all the time. And no one's going to like impact fees either that has to pay them. But as I think we've all commented, at least with the residential, with the average home price we're talking about, and even with a lesser home price, I don't think it's a deal breaker. Mm-hmm. So my 2 cents is to charge as much impact fee as we can without killing the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Yeah.
I think this plan brings that to the table because we got the flexibility to bring it up or take it down depending on what we see with the impact. So I think you did a great job on this, and I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.
It's just a couple other comments. This path, we started this probably about 3 or 4 years ago now. We have some new commissioners that weren't around when this started. And it came about, when we had several subdivisions come in using a provision in Texas law known as rough proportionality, which in some ways, you could look at it as letting the developer off the hook on some of the money that they would have to expend on improving roads. In the P&Z Commission, we did express some concerns about that impact and as well as the fairness of that with other developers. And, you know, for the fairness issue, you know, Ms. Woodley brought up a great example at the last meeting where we have Ben Sill Farms on one side of Schertz Parkway that has had to pay to extend Live Oak Road. And I'm sure that's not an insignificant cost for about 800 feet of road and sidewalks and everything else, versus the other side of Schertz Parkway, Mesa Oaks, which has had to pay zero in roadway improvements because the existing infrastructure is already there. And having impact fees is a way to be a little bit more fair with the people that are developing. And, you know, I've seen and heard a lot of comments, you know, social media conversations. You know, some people are calling it a tax, and, you know, philosophically, you know, I kind of agree with that. It is a tax.
Yep.
But the bottom line is that we're going to have to be able to pay for new and existing roadway improvements. Our thoroughfare plan shows that we need $229 million worth of roadway improvements. Our pavement condition index report shows that we need tens of millions of dollars worth of repairs on existing streets, and the money's got to come with somewhere. And by setting some sort of impact fee schedule and reviewing it, you know, making sure that we don't damage the growth that's coming and increasing our tax base is a way to, you know, shift some but not all of that burden on the new development. You know, I think the existing residents and businesses get a benefit from the new development, so they should have to pay some of that. But certainly, I think it's appropriate to put some of that on the new development that's coming in and have those people and those businesses pay for some of it. And I think the plan that we've come up with and put together over the last 3 years is fair. It seems logical, and I pretty much totally agree with everything that we're looking at proposing here tonight.
When this council first started looking at developing and growth, a little over 54 years ago, we intentionally set I-35 and I-10 as a general business. Mm-hmm. Primarily was going to be the general business growth of this city. So far, it's worked out pretty good. Yeah. And we got a lot to go yet, but it's still there. We're not down, not at the end of the road yet, but it's going to come. Everybody knows it's there. We've got the water, we've got sewer, just a matter of them coming in and building.
So I'm feeling that we kind of have a general consensus of agreement here. The agenda says public hearing, discussion, and possible action to approve a recommendation to City Council regarding adoption of a roadway impact fee. So if we seem to have a general consensus, then I guess we'd be looking for a motion to make a recommendation to Council.
So I would say this, and this one's maybe a bit different. So we would normally say a recommendation on setting the fee, and so again, you typically do that relative to staff's recommendation. So it could be recommendation from the CIAC on setting and adopting with the phase-in as per staff's recommendation, or make adjustments, double the commercial, drop the single family down if you want. And so you can certainly make whatever motion you're going to make. There may be value, and I'll offer this, my perception of where some of the commission is maybe, as you said, a comfort level with this, but not entirely a comfort level that we maybe haven't gone a bit low on non-res, particularly relative to the concern about small businesses versus larger corporations. So if that's something that there's a consensus on, you can certainly add a caveat to include to council that sort of a concern and say, we went with this, but this is something we struggled with a bit more, and so y'all take a close look at that. I think there may be some value to that if that's where the commission seems to be, just based on the comments I'm hearing. Or you may just say, no, we don't like this at all, and we're going to get a recommendation that's totally different that we're scribbling down what you come up with, which is certainly fine. This was really a starting point. We're comfortable with it, but we are not standing here that doing something different is wrong.
Well, back in the day when I first started coming to these meetings over a decade ago, sitting out in those seats, my first inclination would have been hit them with $50,000 and make them go away.
Yeah. It's a different perspective when you're sitting up
there. It is.
Really is.
And we have to take into account, what's best for the city today and try to make our best guesses as what's best for the city in the future. I think this is a pretty reasonable plan, but again, looking for commissioners here to make a motion.
It just appears to me that the residential side is taking the lion's share of the fee right now.
That's accurate, yes, sir.
And I'm not sitting very comfortable with that right now. I would like to see the non-residential side come up a little bit.
Okay.
How we do that, I'm not sure based on the mechanics of how you guys did this, but we're assessing $100 per service unit. You mentioned it. Do we double it? Do we go up by 50%? Yeah. What could we do? I wouldn't mind going up on it a little bit and reducing the 5 years down to 2. That'll give the business community a little bit of time, a couple of years to plan, rather than giving them a 5 years. Let's look at maybe 2 years. If what's the rest of the commission think about that? Maybe reducing the incremental increase to 2 years, and then going up in the years 3 through 5. Non-residential, yeah. Yep.
So we were recommending that there wouldn't be any incremental increase over 5 years, so that it would be starting at 100 and staying 100 for the full 5 years. So you're suggesting 100 for 2 years and then bump it up?
Well, how did you come up with $100 per service unit?
Sat around a table and we argued about it for a while. And
Okay, that's fine.
All right, well, let's go with 100. True. I mean, I'm not. There is no magic to it.
No, that's fine.
That's how we came up.
That's great. That's fine. So we sit at $100 for the first 2 years, and then in years 3, 4, and 5 we go up. In the residential we go up $100 per year. Why don't we do the same for non-residential?
So years 1 and 2, 100. Year 3, 200, 300, 400.
I thoroughly disagree with that, only because, as we were discussing earlier, your commercial projects, number one, are much larger. Yeah, even if they're international conglomerates, they're much larger. So the impacts fees are going to be per project more substantial. Okay, the fact that you're only paying a little over $4,000 for a 10,000 square foot shopping center is pretty small, but at the same time, every house brings with it over 3 living unit equivalents, whatever that number is, or off the top of my head, I forget, but 3 point something, because they're the ones that cost us. The residential units are the ones that cost us the roadways, the maintenance and everything else. Whereas the commercial folks, yes, they have a roadway requirement, but it's nowhere near the length, the width, et cetera, of a residential development. And again, overall costs, yeah, we're going from 0 to 2022, but it's still only $600-700 more than some of our neighbors, and still less than other, appropriately sized communities. Granted, our commercial is a little bit on the low side, but as Mr. James said, we are looking for commercial to locate here for the other benefits that it provides in tax bases and jobs and other income producing elements. That's my
and also point out on this that if we do have a larger project coming in, and we want to incentivize them. That if we have this large fee that we're charging for the roadway impact fees, and we want to incentivize them to get them to come to Schertz instead of somewhere else, that the EDC will have to spend some of their budget. In essence, EDC pays that impact fee out of their funds to incentivize them, is the way I understand the process.
Sure,
and so it also has
one of the elements that could be
budgetary
used.
impact on EDC if we raise up the rates to where we have a $5 million impact fee on a large employer that wants to come in, and then EDC has to pony up, a large chunk of that money to provide the incentive.
Well, I wasn't even thinking of that part of it, but thank you for bringing that up. I was just thinking more about being able to attract that business number one before they even come to us with a request for incentives, et cetera. They're looking at the overall area. How much is it going to cost to build, et cetera? Are we even competitive to begin with? Because if we're competitive, then they'll come in and say, hey, give us some incentives, and they'll feel better about it. But if we're not even competitive, they won't even come in and ask.
So, Mr. Bro, something just, if it's helpful, the other way to look at it that we kind of kicked around is a percentage increase. And so again, what we've done is we've started at 600, we've gone up to 1,000. It's $400, but it's just over a 50% increase in terms of the fee over that 5-year window. And so if you did a similar percentage increase, we'd go up to 166 or whatever it is. But again, you still may feel that's too low and whatnot, but I think that's kind of how we looked at it. I think you've hit on the problem we struggled with is there's so much variability on commercial when you look at it based on size that's problematic and type of use, that on one hand you look at it and go, oh yeah, just doubling that's easy, but then another project, whoa, that we struggle with too, for what it's worth there.
That formula that you came up with, that's fine. I could live with that. But as far as competitiveness, we're at the bottom of the scale on all the cities that we're going up against. So I think there's room, even with New Braunfels. Cibolo's way out of whack, but even with New Braunfels, there's room to improve, or there's room to come up with New Braunfels. If somebody's thinking of coming into this south central area of Texas, it's going to be San Marcos, New Braunfels, Cibolo, Schertz. Yeah. It's going to be that area. So I think there's room to at least be on par with New Braunfels. Yeah. And that's kind of where I'd like to go. Be sort of on par with what our neighbors are.
So if I could make a suggestion, if we started at $100 per service unit for years 1 and 2, we'd be where we're showing on these graphs as far as the comparisons. And if we had a goal of, by year 5, $200 per service unit for the 20,000 square foot warehouse, that would put us at about 22,000, which, drawing that across the board, puts us twice as high as New Braunfels, higher than Taylor, in the ballpark with Cibolo. If we look at the shopping center, it would be doubled. That would be 8,000. So we are
25% higher than New Braunfels.
Right. Still higher than New Braunfels at that point. And then for the warehouse, we'd be up to 24,000, which would again be higher than New Braunfels, but in line with or less than some others.
Well, that's assuming that also the New Braunfels does not increase their rates over that same period of time.
That's true.
That's right.
That's absolutely.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with an incremental increase, but to just double and double and double, that's
Right.
way out of line.
Oh, they have a mechanism, so we we can go with the mechanism of how they came up with this around the table. That would be good.
And then the other thing you could simply do, if this was a comfort level I'll offer up, is so let me offer this up. You could go back, I'm going the wrong way, sorry, with our phase in. Again, part of it's not to get overly complicated, because one of the questions is, particularly relative to commercial, unlike single-family residential, is a 1-year window of a stair step is less of a big deal to us And so what you could do is just say, look, we'll start it at this, but then year 3 or 4, we're going to go up to what we're going to go up to, and we're going to just do it one time. So I don't get into a big battle on commercial, because the way commercial works is a big different. I get people missing a date or hitting a date and having a jump. So I might suggest on commercial, rather than do the 3, 4, 5 like we've done for residential, just because of the nature of it, just kind of go, look, either in year 3 or 4, we go to this amount, that's the amount we go to, and it's just a little bit cleaner, I think, for commercial folks to keep track of. So if that, for example, would be year 4, let's go up to 175 as an example, which maybe keeps us a little more in line with New Braunfels. Just do that year 4 and be done with it, might be my suggestion. It's easier for staff. It keeps people from having to race to beat a date or not, but gets us, I think, where you're wanting to go. And what we really give up on that $25 in year 3 difference isn't in the lot.
I'm good with that.
I'm good with that.
Okay, so say year 4, we go up to 175 on non-res. That
I'm good with that.
okay? Okay. Yeah. Did you touch on the vehicle mile credit versus the dollar for dollar much?
No.
Okay, so if I may, not to derail you on this, but to be clear, the other thing that we are recommending that we haven't covered as much is staff is recommending we do a vehicle mile credit for roads constructed. Okay, so keep in mind, for every dollar you've pulled down, it's a sort of it hurts the guy building the road. Okay, the problem with going for a dollar for dollar credit is there are too many kind of unknowns in terms of how much problem we get on developers going, now I'm owed money, and we really start dipping into it. And so this is frankly a compromise system today. Is there's no benefit. You know, the guy building the road, he's really stuck. He's better off than he was under the current system. He's not as good as a dollar for dollar, but staff strongly feels like that's the case to stay with the vehicle mile credit going forward, because we think what happens in a lot in those cases, once people understand the system, is they frankly factor that into the sale price of land, and we think that kind of will make up the difference of the vehicle mile versus the dollar for dollar credit. The other thing I'll say is my perception, because keep in mind on the rough proportionality, just to touch on that, we didn't have a rough proportionality mechanism that we could back up that was quantifiable, so we went with the San Antonio methodology because we felt like it was defensible in court, that people wouldn't balk at it, and no one has balked at it, which is good for us. This system, I think, my perception is, will be less advantageous to developers on rough proportionality. So I think there will be less we will be giving away on rough proportionality than we had in the past. I think we'll see a benefit there as well for what it's worth, because our system is tailored to us, not San Antonio, and so it's a little more specific. And again, that you don't have to make a recommendation on, but and not that you have to say anything about the way we do credits, but just wanted to be clear that that's something that we talked a lot with developers about. Staff feels very strongly we do a vehicle mile credit as opposed to a dollar for dollar credit.
So are we going to see more or less of that rough proportionality? You
will see less rough proportionality. And why you will see less rough proportionality is, one, because I think that the new formula for determining that is a little more realistic and will benefit the city. So that's one reason. The other reason is I have the ability to, the problem is I now have a mechanism by which to reimburse a developer or offset a developer who gets out of whack with rough proportionality. So say I have a project that comes in, and if they built 3/4 of the adjacent roads, that would be roughly proportional. The other 25% isn't. Because, again, of how we do the vehicle mile credit, I can then trade off what they would pay in fees to get them to build a road. And so you will have less rough proportionality where things aren't built. The new system, the way it pays. I will also, if, again, I don't have that, I have the ability to draw from our roadway impact fee funds collected and say, hey, when you go out and build that $300,000 segment of road, and it's not road proportional to get you to do this segment, I can say, I can pay for that. And if it's under a certain percentage of the project, don't have to go through bidding requirements. I can say, look, you're out there doing it. You can get some greater efficiencies. It's a win-win. You get this section built. I've got this pool of money, so I'll kick in another $50,000, build that section that is lacking due to rough proportionality, and get it done. So I think we'll have less of that than we've had. We'll still have some, but less.
All right. Any other comments, questions? I guess, Brian, could you help out with suggestions on how to phrase this motion?
Sure. So the Capital Improvements Advisory Committee makes a recommendation that we adopt roadway impact fee amounts and phase-ins as recommended by staff with the adjustment to non-residential fees increasing from $100 per service unit to $175 per service unit in the fourth year. That would be your recommendation. So if you say that, we can then copy.
I say that.
Okay.
All right. So language by Mr. James, motion by Mr. Brown. Do I have a second?
I second.
Second with Mr. Greenwald. All right, Commissioners, any other comments or questions? All right, we'll call for a vote. Start with Mr. Pinchorn.
Aye.
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 Aye. Motion carries.
Thank you very much. This is a tough one. What we will do is we will get the minutes of this to kind of capture some, because I think that's helpful for council to hear what y'all talked about and went through, so they can kind of chew on that going forward. But thank you very much. The good news is hopefully your work here with this is done. The bad news is as soon as Kathy gets this to council, she's rolling out the water and sewer master plan updates and impact fees as well. So you'll get to go through this with that stuff that's yeah, is what it is. So
right. If, Mr. Chair, if I can say, Brian and all the entire staff, from when we started on this on the master thoroughfare plan and the roadway impact and the road condition study and all the other stuff that we've done, these have been some of the best reports I've ever seen on working or volunteering for the city. I appreciate all the work you guys did. It's finally come to fruition. Well, almost. It's finally come before us where we can take some action on this, and I appreciate all the work that we've done also with our contractor. The contractor did very good work.
Good job as well.
It was a very good report, and it's kind of like a standard that we can measure everything in the future on. So thank you a lot. Appreciate it.
You're right, and I want to say a lot of the credit, I think our consultant did a really good job, very good. We're very pleased with that. Kathy in engineering, Lisa, Bryce, Drew in economic development really helped out, Kyle as well in pulling this. So a lot of folks did a lot of stuff. So yeah, we will continue to strive to hit this level of information going forward on projects.
It's been great, and like Mr. Bro said, the information and the depth of the information that we're getting has improved greatly, and you know, I know for my part I've appreciated it, and just let's keep it going.
And then I'll say, assuming council does approve fairly short order, again, what we will likely do is call a meeting of the CIAC, and we will walk you through, here's the final ordinance, just to show you what it looks like. Here are the handout materials that staff will prepare to inform folks. So again, we want handouts for folks. Here's how roadway impact fees work. Here's what they're for. We'll show you the online calculation tool so you can very clearly see. So as you're out in the community and somebody says, how do I calculate? You can go, oh, let me see. It's really easy. Go to the website, boom, boom, boom. So we'll likely pull you together to kind of walk you through that, just so you kind of see the finished product as we go forward.
And we'll prepare a letter report based on the minutes and your motion and have that ready for Mr. Dowley's signature. So that's how it will be presented to council as the formal recommendation. So hopefully within the next week we'll have that, and we'll give you a call.
Anybody have anything else? All right, meeting adjourned, 7:40.